I know some of you are a little disappointed, but maybe we'll see the porn stunts gone wrong talk at Fast 22. All right, let's get serious. So today I want to talk about creativity. Specifically, we're going to start with two things, and each one of them is something that creative people fear. So what do you think that is? What do you think creative people fear? In my mind, the very first thing is that the best work has already been done. So if you're a painter, maybe you think about Michelangelo and the creation of Adam. Or if you're a musician, maybe you think about Queen and Bohemian Rhapsody. Or if you're a tech developer, maybe you think about Apple and the iPhone. Or if you're like me and you dream of writing your novel one day, you fear that you won't be as good as your favorite author. For me, it's the book Slaughterhouse-Five by Kurt Vonnegut. Because what happens when all the best stuff has already been done? I want to reintroduce you to somebody named Oscar Wilde, and he's known for a lot of different stuff. Some people might think about him as like a pure celebrity because he was the one who said, the only thing worse than being talked about is not being talked about. And people still repeat that many years later. Or you think about him as an author or a playwright. He did the Portrait of Dorian Gray as his most favorite piece. But I think about him as a true observer of people. He really saw through the stuffy social muck of his time, and he really saw how unoriginal people really were. And that's a really scary thought because that's the other thing. The first thing was that the best work has already been done. That was the first fear. The second fear for creative people is that you're being unoriginal. Notice what he said about originality. He said, most people are other people. Their thoughts are someone else's opinions. Their lives, a mimicry. Their passions, a quotation. I think for creative people, their number one most feared thing is that they're being unoriginal. But let's see if we can flip this around and make it more applicable to what we do. What if somebody said this? Most practitioners are other practitioners. Their treatments are someone else's guidelines. Their protocols, a mimicry. Their passions, a podcast. If you want to be creative in medicine, it's difficult. It's no secret that today we live in a giant echo chamber that's pretty hard to escape, right? Somebody says something, it goes all the way down the line, and eventually it comes right back to us. And what that leaves is evidence-based medicine. EBM starts to become everyone's basis for medicine. And when it comes to creativity, that can leave you feeling a little unoriginal. Like we do nothing but follow protocols and we're not really different than anybody else. It can leave you feel like maybe you've been inculcated into the league of FOMED where everyone listens to and reads the same things and does the same stuff. And it can leave you feeling like you're just another number, like there's no room to get creative because you're just following guidelines. I remember sitting at a conference one day and I was listening to a talk loosely on mechanical ventilation. And I looked around the audience and I thought to myself, I bet you if I had a conversation with any one of these people right now and asked them, what they use for vent settings or what they would do in these different mechanical ventilation scenarios, all they would do is just regurgitate this lecture, the MCRIT lecture, Dominating the Vent Part 1, and they definitely throw in Part 2 as well. Don't get me wrong. It's amazing to have evidence-based medicine, and FOMED helps us to get our hands on this and start trying to incorporate it into our practice so well. If most people use evidence-based medicine, so many of our problems would be solved, but the process never stops there. No one stopped painting because of the Sistine Chapel. No one stopped making music because Queen released Bohemian Rhapsody. No one stopped building tech after the Apple iPhone was released. No one stopped writing books after Slaughterhouse-Five was released. Your brain is... Hang on. I got to turn on some epic music and some stock footage for this next part. All right, much better. Your brain is unique. You have the ability to personalize patient care and be really, really good at it. You have the ability to have a quote-unquote specialty that people believe that you are just like the master of. You have the ability to create new ways of doing things or new ways of teaching things that make it click with people or improves on a process. No matter who you are, you see the world in a very unique way, and you have something special to share with people. You just might not be sure what that thing is yet or how to get creative in the first place. But I'm going to help you figure out where your creative zone is. And I call that finding a place for your brain. Part 1, focused and diffuse. I used to work with a guy who said that whenever he had a problem that he was having trouble solving, what he would do is he would take a pen and a paper and he would write the problem down before he went to sleep. And he said that every time he did this, he would wake up and somehow he would have the answer to his problem. And I didn't think much about that. I always thought that's an interesting way to approach that. I'm sure there's something to it, but I mostly forgot about it. And then one day I was reading this book, and here's a book I definitely recommend. It's called A Mind for Numbers by Dr. Barbara Oakley. And she talks about this thing called focused and diffuse thinking, and it really changed the way that I thought about getting deep into a subject. And so I'm going to borrow her illustration here and then this little brain teaser that she uses in here. I want to see if you guys can figure it out. You can kind of play along at home. So here's the first illustration that she used. She used the illustration of a pinball machine. So check this out. So we have this pinball machine, and you're going to see the little pinball come up. And what's going to happen here is it's going to hit all these bumpers. You can see in this pinball setup here, there's a ton of different bumpers. And so it gets stuck right inside of one particular area. And that was the focus part. You see how everything kind of sits right in this one area where it's bouncing around? That's kind of like having that idea all in one area of our brain, and the idea starts to grow the more we learn about that subject. So if that's the focused part, what's the diffuse part? Well, the pinball setup is going to change a little bit, and we're going to get rid of a ton of those bumpers. So look at this one over here. So again, that idea, a little pinball comes up, but this time it doesn't get stuck in one area. It's got the ability to bounce all over the place because it doesn't have so many obstacles. And you can think about this as kind of that more relaxed, the idea is bouncing around everywhere, and we're generating new ideas in this way because it's going to other parts of our brain. And so to illustrate this point, and this like really drove it home with me, is she presented this challenge in the book, and it was with 10 dimes. I'll show it to you. So take a look at this picture right here. You have 10 dimes, and they're pointing in a up-facing triangle. So it's pointing towards the top of the screen. Now, the challenge was to take these 10 dimes, and by only moving 3 of them, you can only move 3, you have to make it so that the triangle faces down. And I had the hardest time with this. And so I was really thinking about it, and I was in that very focused mode of thinking, and I was overthinking it. And it was really interesting what happened. So I started playing around with this, and I got some change out, and I was like, which ones would I move? Because I hate going to the answer for a brain teaser. I'm like, I have to figure this out. I know the answer is really simple, but for some reason, I just can't think of it right now. And so I'm like, okay, I'll move these top 3 ones, and we'll see if that gets me a downward-facing triangle. And I was like, it's kind of close. If I just cover up these top ones right here, then that would definitely be a downward-facing triangle, but those aren't the rules. The whole thing has to be a downward-facing triangle. So I'm like, okay, that's not going to work, right? So look at this again, and I'm going to help us fast forward into a diffuse mode of thinking. Maybe some of you guys have the answer right now. Maybe some of you guys don't. So stare. This is what happened to me. I was like ready to give up and find the answer at the back of the book, and I was just staring at it. And I was thinking, why can't I figure out this problem? And I was staring at it, I'm staring. And this is what started to happen to my vision. Are you guys staring at that center dime? the ones on the corners, they started to almost go dark in my vision. And I saw that there was this shape that appeared in my brain once I stopped thinking so hard about it. And you can see that the shape is highlighted in blue here, a hexagon. And then I started to realize that you kind of have these triangles on each side. And then I started to think, well, I could just move those ones, right? And so if we go back to the problem here, if you just move the outer three, you can get the triangle to point up, you can get the triangle to point down by only moving those three. But as hard as I thought about it, I couldn't come up with the answer. It's almost like the logical part of my brain couldn't figure it out. It had to migrate somewhere else in my head in order to figure that out when I wasn't really trying to, right? And so this is the focused or diffuse. Is one better than the other? You have to stop thinking about it as focused or diffuse. Think about focused then diffuse. When we get to an area in our thinking, in our study, where that idea becomes stuck somewhere, it's time to take a break. It's time to then do diffuse thinking, where we remove some of these barriers for this thought to roll around. And so focused, how do we do that? First, after you study hard, think about, what do I actually remember from this? Because we can just get in this zone of reading and reading and reading, and it becomes this passive exercise where we're not even absorbing it anymore. And so think about, what do I remember from what I just read, listened to, studied, did, whatever that process is. And then after that, what we do is we think, how can I explain it? I have these conversations in my brain all the time when I'm studying something or I'm building a talk or whatever, or trying to figure out a point. And I think to myself, how would I explain this to somebody? My brain just goes there, and I have this imaginary conversation of, with somebody who has no idea what this subject is. And I think, like, what would I say to them in order to get them to understand? That's the focus part of it. And then what about diffuse? So diffuse, this is when we get those new understandings, those new ideas, deeper understandings, because it can go around to different parts of our brain. So let's visualize this real quick and see what happens going from focus to diffuse. So this little idea starts to occur, and it grows in size, but there's a limit to it. There's a limit to focused, logical thinking where these barriers go up, and that idea can't grow anymore, and it really can't be expounded upon. So what do we have to do? Somehow we have to break those barriers down so that that idea can go and find its perfect spot in our brain where we're going to generate new ideas about that thing. So I thought it was really interesting as I was writing this talk. I was reading this book called Flowers for Algernon. It's a super good book. If you guys have seen this before, older book. This was printed in 1959, I think, by Daniel Keyes. Super good book. It's loosely based. If you guys have ever seen that Simpsons episode where Homer gets the crayon removed from his brain and becomes really smart.
We could remove the crayon for you. It could vastly increase your brain power, or it could possibly kill you.
Increase my killing power, eh? Let's do it.
It's loosely based on this book. So I'm going to show you guys a passage from this book because I don't think that I could articulate this process any better than this book did. It was just happenstance that I was reading this at the same time that I was writing this. And so Charlie, the main character, he becomes a genius by having this operation, essentially, very similar to how Homer became very smart when they pulled the crayon out of his nose. And so he's working on this hypothesis. He's trying to figure out why Algernon, from the name of the book, is starting to regress because Algernon had the same procedure to make him very, very smart. He's a lab mouse.
So, where did that rat come from?
He must have brought it in with him.
And so here's what Charlie was struggling with. Blind alley for the past 2 days. Nothing. I've taken a wrong turn somewhere because I get answers to a lot of questions, but not to the most important question of all. How does Algernon's regression affect the basic hypothesis of the experiment? Fortunately, I know enough about the processes of the mind not to let this block worry me too much. Instead of panicking and giving up, or what's even worse, pushing hard for answers that won't come, I've got to take my mind off the problem for a while and let it stew. I've gone as far as I can on a conscious level, and now it's up to those mysterious operations below the level of awareness. It's one of those inexplicable things, how everything I've learned and experienced is brought to bear on the problem. Pushing too hard will only make things freeze up. How many great problems have gone unsolved because men didn't know enough or have enough faith in the creative process and in themselves to let go for the whole mind to work at it. So this was written in 1959, and I thought it was super fitting for what we were talking about today. But if we go back even further to 1905, this is a great case in point on how this diffuse process can really work. This is Albert Einstein, and at the time he was working in a patent office, and he was working on his theories. He was working on the theory of special relativity, E equals mc squared, and here's how he eventually came to solving those problems, proving his theories. So one day he's in Bern, Switzerland, and there's this clock tower, and he's on a streetcar, which you could also think of like essentially like a trolley going through Bern, Switzerland. And he was looking out the back window at this clock tower. And he imagined himself. He was in the diffuse mode of thinking. He's not sitting down studying. He wasn't thinking hard about these problems. He had done all that work ahead of time, and his brain was primed to solve this problem. How so? So when he was traveling in the streetcar, he imagined, just an epiphany, just a kind of a eureka moment. He imagined that the streetcar was traveling away from the clock tower at the speed of light. Why? Because he hypothesized that if he was moving away from the source of the light at the same speed as light, he would perceive the clock tower as being frozen in time. You can imagine that. As he's moving away, speed of light, the light that's reaching him, they've reached equilibrium, and now he perceives it as being frozen in time. So how do we do that? How do we take Einstein's method of thinking, this passage from Flowers for Algernon, how do we let that apply to us? Well, after we've done that really focused form of thinking, studying hard, priming our brain to have these ideas in the first place, it's time to take a break and do something when we're not thinking so hard about everything. Because you'll hear people say that all the time. I wasn't thinking about anything, and all of a sudden I got the answer to my problem. It just came to me. It's because the brain was working on it on a subconscious level. Maybe it's time to take the dog out for a walk. This is moose. This is diffuse mode thinking right now. It lets your brain have those ideas just floating around to different parts of your brain until they find an area that just fits, and you come up with your eureka moment. Or maybe after that, it's time for a little nap with the dog, or maybe you do something different. But just be mindful. Are you working on your goals more, or are you constantly giving yourself rewards for doing nothing? If you think about it almost like food, are we eating dessert for every single meal? Or is dessert this special thing that we do after we've eaten a bunch of healthy food? Think about your thoughts the same way. To earn that diffuse mode thinking, we've got to study hard on the front end so that we actually have some ideas to work with. Part 2, regulation. So you get up every morning, and like most people, you probably make a cup of coffee, right? You've probably been doing it every morning and maybe even into the afternoon for years and years and years. And what happens if you ever try to go just cold turkey on coffee? Well, your body doesn't like that very much. Nobody does, because we've been drinking this coffee, and our body becomes really reliant on that exogenous source of energy. And it doesn't. If we stop drinking coffee, the body's not very adept at making that energy for itself, and so we kind of go into these withdrawals and we feel like garbage. Let's look at another example of something exogenous. So let's say that one day you decide that you want to be a bodybuilder, right? So you start taking anabolic steroids. So you take a bunch of testosterone, right? You're taking this testosterone, and what does the body do? The body's not stupid. What the body's going to do is it's going to sense that, okay, I've got loads and loads of exogenous testosterone coming in. So what am I going to do? Well, since we have all this exogenous testosterone coming from somewhere, I'm just going to stop making it. I'm not going to double up and continue to produce this thing when we're getting it clearly from somewhere else. And one more example. So you take some kind of medication. Let's say just for some reason tomorrow I start taking Synthroid, but I have a healthy thyroid, right? So I start taking this Synthroid. What's going to happen? Is my body going to continue to produce thyroid hormone? No, it's not. It's going to stop producing that because it's going to sense that I'm already getting that from somewhere. Okay, so what's the point? Anytime that we take in something exogenous, the body, the brain, it knows that, and so it stops producing that thing. So how does this work into creativity? How does this work into new ideas? Well, let's graph this out real quick first. Let's say we have substance X. The body's always checking to see, is it high or is it low? Now, if it's low, what's the body going to do? It's going to make more of that thing, and then it's going to go back into the systems of checks and balances where it says, how much of substance X do I have? And if it ends up being high, what's the body going to do? Like the instance of the energy from the caffeine, or the synthetic thyroid hormone, or the testosterone, it's going to halt production of that thing until it goes back and it checks for more, right? So when we think about creativity, new ideas, things like that, and we have this brain right here, and it's checking high or low. When might our brain halt production of new ideas? Well, if it's already full of new ideas from various places, if you spend a lot of time on here, and I'm not one of these people who's like, delete your social media. I think there's totally a place for it. But how much time do we spend on it, and how much of those ideas are we absorbing? How much of it is kind of just clouding our mind to the point where we're taking in so much the body doesn't feel like it needs to produce anything more? So we have these original ideas. Let's graph this out. It's going to check high or low. Low is on the left. So what's it going to do? It's going to make more, right? And then we come back to that system of regulation, checks and balances. If it's high, what's the body going to do? It's going to say, I'm already getting a ton of this stuff. I'm going to go ahead and halt production. And this can happen really easily because we all know that social media is super addicting, right? And so the brain can get stuck in this cycle over here where we're just consuming and consuming and consuming, and we just never really have this need to produce anything of our own because we're taking in so much. So the brain has this choice. Is it going to go to the left or is it going to go to the right? Is it going to go towards the hard stuff on the left or the easy stuff on the right? It's a tough choice for the brain to make if we're really attuned to this stuff over here on the right, because over on the left, this stuff is active. The right is passive. The left for the brain is dangerous. The right for the brain is very safe. The left might even be a little bit painful for the brain. On the other side, the right is very comfortable. It's passive, safe, comfortable over in this area if we spend too much time there. So I would like to present a challenge. Here's what I want you to try. Find something that you're interested in. Don't find something where you're like, I don't really have an interest in this too much. Find something that you find fascinating and really get deep into it. Study it, take notes, be really absorbed in it. And I just want you to be conscious of one thing. How long until your brain starts to try to pull you away from that into one of these passive activities? I'll show you what I mean, and I'm going to present these distractors in no particular order. So we have all these ones down in the bottom. How long does it take just until you feel the pull? 10 minutes, 20 minutes? Is it somewhere in this half an hour range? Can you make it somewhere between a half an hour and an hour? Or maybe you can go an hour or more before you get distracted by one of these things. If you can't make it, even 10, 20, 30 minutes of that focused thinking, you got to really think, these things are really good at pulling at our pleasure center in our head. And so is our dopamine a little bit out of whack where we constantly need to be picking up the phone, constantly need to be looking at social media to the point where we can't come up with any new original ideas ourselves? Could it be one of the reasons why we don't feel very creative during a certain time? Because the body doesn't feel the need to produce these new ideas. You've got plenty of them right here. It's cycling. Like I said, I'm not one of these people who's like, oh, delete all your social media. I certainly don't. But it's got to be put in its proper place, right? I think about it almost like a workout program. Any good personal trainer is going to have you on a very set regimen to figure out how can you get stronger. And so if we think about the brain a little bit like a muscle, Let's go with traditional strength here first. So we have energy expended and then we have strength on the top. So what's going to happen is your personal trainer is going to tell you go hard and then we go a little bit light and we kind of continue this trend over the course of weeks. We don't take this linear straight up, drive and energy expended. You got to be careful. And then you reach a precipice here. And then you take this thing called a deload week. And a deload week is when you barely do any work. You might take the entire week off of working out. And what this allows the strength to do is to rebound. And so this is called super compensation. What happens is your strength when you're working out is going down and down and down and down and down because you're putting yourself into this energy hole. You're working into an energy debt. And so what happens is you're getting weaker that entire time. You don't get stronger in the gym. You get stronger when you sleep, when you rest, right? And the body rebuilds itself. And so as the energy expended goes down at the end of this cycle, what happens is the strength goes up, right? So what if we were to replace some of this stuff on the screen? Instead of energy expended or strength, let's replace these with a couple things. Creativity and new ideas, mental energy expended, right? And so when we do this, we can have that super compensation, just like we would with a muscle that we've been working out and working out and working out. If we can hit this cycle just right, we can have this creativity, these new ideas, and we can use that super compensation, just like a muscle. Part 3, mastery. I'm going to talk about a couple of concepts that I bet you guys have seen before, but I'd like to shine them in a different light and talk about them specifically in the context of creativity and having new ideas and really getting involved in a project that's very specific. So this initial graph here is going to be wrong because this is the way that most people think it would go. So there's confidence on the y-axis, and then it can either be low or high, and then competence on the x-axis, and it can be a know-nothing or power all the way over to guru. And we would initially think it goes like this, right? But unfortunately, it doesn't. This is a totally false graph. If you guys have heard of this thing called the Dunning-Kruger effect, which I'm sure you've heard of if you've partaken of any FOMED in the past 10 years and human factor performance and things like that, psychology of resuscitation, things like that, you've probably seen that this graph takes some really funny turns. And so it starts with this initial jet up in confidence while we still know like nothing. And this is called the peak of Mount Stupid. Doesn't sound like a place where we want to spend much time. Fortunately, we don't spend too much time there. It seems like we rapidly get humbled, and then we come down here into the Valley of Despair. Really great place. It's two really great places to be, right? Peak of Mount Stupid followed by the Valley of Despair. Now, then the graph starts making a little bit more sense after we've been humbled from our initial peak of Mount Stupid, where we come over here to the slope of enlightenment. So then it continues to make more sense as we go up to the top right. And if we can get all the way over here to the top right, which very few people make it to, it's the plateau of sustainability. Now, how I would like to change this and talk about kind of our careers and our aspirations as far as creativity and creating things goes, I want to add this thing called the 10,000 hour rule to the bottom of it. And a lot of experts agree that this is legitimate. If you spend 10,000 hours of deliberate practice and study on something, you're essentially what people would call an expert or a guru or whatever. But it takes a lot of time to master a subject like that. But after those 10,000 hours, supposedly you are a master of that subject. That's a lot of time. So and I feel like this is pretty accurate. I'll show you guys why in a second. Think about this. If you're in medicine for 5 years, what if I study 1 hour every single day? 1 hour every single day. Where do you think you'd end up? Maybe not as far as you would think. So you'd end up right about here. Now, if you add in a little bit of schooling, a little bit of extra classes, a little bit of calls that you learn from, because this doesn't include like the 24/48 that you work, like just hours worked. Exposure does not equal experience. And so this is like gaining actual experience, actually studying, deliberate practice, and things like that. So you end up probably right here in the Valley of Despair after about probably 5 years of being like that. Now, I said we'd get back to that career length thing. That's what I'm talking about. The average EMS career length is about 5 years. And so I think that this correlates pretty well, because I bet you a lot of people decide to leave right after they leave the peak of Mount Stupid, and then they feel like things are never going to look up. But little do they know, that's right when the slope of enlightenment happens, and then way later on, that plateau of sustainability. Tyler talked about that in one of his keynotes as well, that this is usually when people start leaving the field, trying to do other things. But the bad part about that is you start all the way back over at the bottom left. And so when you decide to go do something else and you go chasing this other idea, you go right back up to the peak of Mount Stupid because you're resetting things. But you've already put in all this time to this thing, and you could be hitting that gradual slope up to where you keep getting better and better and better. But people think it's this Valley of Despair is never going to end, right? So what if I was in medicine for 10 years? What if I studied 2 hours every single day? Well, that's a lot of time studying, but you would be well on your way to this plateau of sustainability. But you might be thinking, that sounds really boring, right? If you were to graph that out on your week and try to fit in not just 1, but 2 hours of, essentially hitting the books in some way, that doesn't seem sustainable. Unless you're a real reader and you're just a knowledge purist where you just love to know things for the sake of knowing things, it's going to be pretty difficult. And you might think that you'd run out of things to learn, but I guarantee you that you never will. But it's much easier, and you could even have a week that's structured something like this if you had specific goals in mind. So you got different colors on here. Imagine that the blue is writing classes, right? So maybe an hour in the morning, an hour in the evening, you focus on writing classes, and then maybe that purple stuff is actually teaching and talking to students and answering questions if you got yourself involved in some kind of teaching role. And maybe the yellow one is like a podcast, and maybe these gray ones up on the top of Friday, maybe that's when you spend a little bit of extra time and you decide you're going to write for a blog instead of a class, or study for a podcast that you're going to do. The point being that when you have specific goals in mind, this slope here and these hours, they don't really become intimidating anymore. We can't focus on, are we on a peak of Mount Stupid, or are we in the valley of despair? How long until we get to this slope of enlightenment? We can't let it get us down. We just have to be happy with where we are and figure out some projects to get us into the future and continue, because this is going to happen either way. And we just have to figure out what's going to get us continuing to move forward regardless of where we are. I always have to remind myself of that because I'm a big projects person. And so I always tend to think that my sense of accomplishment or my happiness is going to be right on the other side of this project, but it's not. I don't know who said it, but there's a famous saying that goes that if you can't get happiness to be where you are, it'll never be where you're going either. I pretty much slaughtered that, but you get the point. If you can't figure out how to be happy now with where you are and what you're doing and how you're studying and where you are on this graph, no matter what point you get to here, you'll always feel like there's the next thing. And so you just have to accept that it's part of the process. But if you want to get into that process and you actually want to start, you should probably have some goals in mind, because you want to be able to apply that knowledge, apply that creativity somewhere. Conclusion. So first we talked about focused and diffuse thinking and how important it is to be able to switch from one mode to the other so that ideas can float around our brain effectively. And then in part 2, we talked about regulation. And regulation was always about controlling what came into our brain, because if we had a lot of exogenous stimulus, then our brain might not be prompted to create our own new and fresh ideas. And then we went to part 3, which is all about mastery. And mastery was about the 10,000 hour rule and the Dunning-Kruger effect. And then we talked about having specific goals so that your creativity, all the effort that you put in, it doesn't seem wasted. But in talking about all of that stuff, I never mentioned that creativity has prerequisites. And I bet you've seen what they are before. I bet you everybody's seen what they are. And it sounds obvious, but we can use this stuff as a checklist when we're not feeling creative. Or you might not even have the want to be creative. Some people want to be creative, but they can't just quite get there. And then other people just have no motivation to be creative whatsoever. But if we use this checklist, you might figure out why. So as I'm popping these things up on the screen, do a mental checklist and say, am I deficient in any one of these areas? Because it commonly happens to all of us. We look at this list and we say, whoa, I have that area like way screwed up. No wonder I'm not feeling creative. So check out what this is. So you have your basic needs down here. This is the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? Security, safety, stuff like food, water, warmth, rest. Those are your basic needs. Then you have physical needs up here. Intimate relationships, friends, prestige, feelings of accomplishment. You need those things. And then self-fulfilling needs up on top, achieving our full potential. Creating, the want to create, because it's the hierarchy of needs, right? Things that we need. And if you're deficient in one of these areas, everything above it goes to crap. So let's go down, way bottom of the pyramid here, and let's say that your rest is not on point. Once that bottom rung is done, that's going to affect everything above it. And so there's a lot of people out there who think, I'm just not creative, or they might say, I don't want to be one of those creative people. But Maslow would disagree. I don't believe that there are people out there who are not creative. And I also don't really believe the people who say that they don't want to be creative. I want to share one final illustration with you here today, and it's of a plant. So a plant is heavily influenced by its environment. It's either going to let the plant flourish or it's going to die. So what are some of these external factors? How can the environment affect this plant? So consider a few things here. The condition of the soil, the amount of sun, the amount of water that it gets, the caregivers, the temperature outside, the proximity of other plants, and then maybe even you could go as far as to say maybe there's animals coming in and they're eating this plant at night. Gardeners run into that frequently. So there's all of these external factors. The plant wants to grow. It's designed to grow. That's its purpose in life. But it's the things influencing it that may not let it grow. And so you can think about your creativity as that little plant. But we'd have to change the factors of the environment, right? So if we were to change these factors to things that would influence creativity, what would they be? Part of our environment, what would they be? Maybe the culture at your job. Maybe the amount of healthy recreation that you're getting. The amount of study that you're doing. Your friends. Who are your mentors? Do you have any? What is your personal care like? What's your proximity to losers? And then instead of animals, let's change that one to haters that try to come in and trample and eat up your creativity. So when you think about, I'm not feeling creative, or I don't want to be a creative person, could it possibly be one of these environmental factors that's actually stunting the growth of that creativity? So don't say that you're not a creative person. Saying you're not a creative person is like blaming a plant for not growing, or saying that a plant won't grow. A plant will grow in the right environment, and your creativity will also grow given the right environment and care. So thank you very much for listening to me talk about creativity today. I really appreciate your time, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. Take care.
So when it comes to gaining and maintaining my creativity, I take 2 simple steps. Step number 1 is get out and get some nice exercise. That's where Samuel's involved. Get a nice run in, get a good catecholamine dump, and it really helps me to develop the macros of whatever I'm starting to work on. So that big overarching plan of what I want to do, be that a training or a video or whatever it is. And then I get into the lab where I can have some quiet and some concentration and build on that macro that I've developed during that workout. And that's where I bring together those finer points.
For me, creativity can come at really any time. But the thing I think is most important is to have a place where you're comfortable with working, where you can lay out different ideas and be fluid with whatever you're working on, whether it's on your computer or spreading out with a notebook and making all different types of ideas. It's important to be comfortable in the place that you're working.
So I'm definitely more creative in the morning, but I can't just wake up, sit down, have a cup of coffee and say, okay, I got to be creative right now. It just doesn't happen like that. And I will get angry with myself if I expect me to come up with some crazy intro for a talk or some really cool illustration for a blog I'm writing. It's more about creating opportunities for you to be creative, but not demanding you to be creative during those opportunities, if that makes sense. So I will allow myself spaces throughout the week where I can just chill. I can grab a sketchbook. I can maybe start to write something that I may never do anything with. That is what really helps me, is allowing space for creativity, but not getting mad if it doesn't happen.
For me, creativity usually starts with a note. I keep a running note on my phone that when a topic comes up, or I see an interesting patient, or I come across an interesting clinical lesson, have a good conversation with somebody else, usually jot down a quick note about what it was about, sometimes a catchy title for something I can do with it. And then when I'm in the right mindset is when I go back, I reapproach it, I kind of dive into it some more, and then translate it into something creative.
I get in a flow state when I try to get comfortable being in the uncomfortable. And 2 specific examples of that are fear is one. So for me as a clinician, I fear the day that I see a patient that I have no idea what's going on with them, whether it's a disease process that I may have heard of, but I have no idea how that disease process works. That's a day that I fear the most and motivates me to kind of learn a little bit more and get into that creative and flow state to learn about it. And the second one is kind of thinking outside the box, challenging professional norms within our industry and kind of thinking outside the box in terms of why have we always done it this way, and could there be another way to kind of push the boundary and, like I said, kind of think outside the box. So hope that helps.
Sam, I am such an asshole. I am so sorry that I have not sent you this like you asked me to do maybe over a week ago. But anyway, my creative process, this is what I do. Usually when I'm asked to do a new project or I'm working on something new that I'm excited about, I'll first go work out so that I can clear my head and get oxygen to my brain, which I kind of feel like helps. After I work out, I will find a place in my house that I don't have any distractions and then I can work. I'll set aside a certain amount of time that I'm going to work on whatever project it is so I don't have to worry about anything else during that time. And then I'll brainstorm and I'll just write a bunch of lists of things that will help me with that project. And sometimes I'll pull out a bunch of different resources. I'm a very visual person, so I'll have like books everywhere and I'll have a couple web pages up. And usually I like to see pictures, so I'll have like anatomy guides, med school books, books from residency, books from stuff that I study now. And then I'll even pull out some journal articles too, so that I have all the information in front of me and then I can put it together and create whatever I'm going to create.
So my name is Saf Kassim. I am an emergency physician, a critical care physician in Philadelphia. I also do pre-hospital care with our neighboring New Jersey-based physician response model. And I'm going to be talking to you about the use of whole blood in trauma, whether it's better than the sum of its parts. So unfortunately, hemorrhage has remained a huge problem for us in trauma, and this is kind of exemplified in a case that you might well be involved in on a more regular basis. An MVC happens, for example, EMS responds, there's a requirement for air medical transport to the nearest trauma center. The patient gets offloaded from the aircraft down to the emergency department, eventually makes its way over to the operating room. But if you look across the board across U.S. trauma systems, there is a significant time period that elapses from the point of injury to the point of definitive hemorrhage control and resuscitation in many ways as well. And that means that hemorrhage has remained an ongoing problem. And we see this in a number of studies, including military data, where this paper really looked at outcomes or reasons for death in our soldiers in the recent conflicts, and found that the majority were due to hemorrhage. When you look at the civilian data, we see kind of similar numbers. A significant proportion of patients in this study had potentially preventable death, and a lot of this was ascribed to hemorrhage. This paper out of Miami also kind of showed the same thing, a significant proportion of potentially preventable death, and majority of those were due to hemorrhage. And when you look at these patients, you'll see that as long as they don't arrive in shock, our advances in trauma center care has really improved outcomes in that subgroup, but the group that arrives in profound hemorrhagic shock, we're still trying to move the needle on those. So why is hemorrhage really a big problem? Well, one of the reasons is that it can affect a number of organ systems and organ functions. There might be direct tissue damage that leads to an endotheliopathy. There is malperfusion at the tissue level, and that leads to metabolic acidosis, which affects a significant number of enzymatic functions. There's an abnormal response to coagulation. The body ends up consuming a lot of the coagulation products and factors, and that actually worsens their response to clotting. And then finally, there might be exposure to the environment. If a body cavity is open, that leads to hypothermia, and that again worsens the body's response to coagulation. So our typical response over decades has been to provide crystalloids to resuscitate these patients, and unfortunately that's still practice in some systems, both pre-hospital as well as in-hospital. But unfortunately, this just exacerbates the problem, right? You're giving a cold acidotic solution which worsens the hypothermia, worsens the acidosis. You're not replacing any of the coagulation factors or the cells that are being lost, and so you're really not solving the problem. And I like this quote from Andre Kapp. I'll leave this up here, but it really gives a sense of what I think and what many people in the trauma community think about the role of crystalloid resuscitation. So we've moved a long way. We do have blood products now, but really what comes out of this person's arm is not what's in most blood banks. The blood gets fractionated into different components, and then you're left deciding, should I give red cells, should I give plasma, should I give platelets, which one should I give first? And this has been a big debate in the trauma world, and that culminated in the PROPER trial a few years ago that showed, yeah, if we give these components in a 1-to-1-to-1 ratio, that probably is the best for the trauma patients. And so if you're thinking about giving red cells, plasma, and platelets in a 1-to-1 ratio, then why not give whole blood instead? And that's really the premise of this talk. And in a lot of ways, it's really kind of going back to and bringing the past back to the future, right? When you look at the conflicts that have happened over the last century, World War I, the only product available really was whole blood. World War II saw the same thing. When you look at the Korean War, a significant number of units of whole blood were given, as was in the Vietnam War. And it wasn't really until the 80s when we moved to component therapy. But again, with the recent conflicts, we've gone kind of full circle with the Committee on Tactical Combat Casualty Care, really recommending whole blood as the most beneficial resuscitation fluid for injured soldiers. And this is freely available in the Joint Trauma Systems guideline about the use of whole blood in trauma. You can certainly look that up and have a review of it. It's got some really good information in there. So let's compare what you get when you compare a unit of whole blood to the equivalent of what you would get with components. So when you look at the components, you get a higher volume of an anemic, thrombocytopenic, coagulopathic fluid that's really high in citrate. So really, when you compare these side by side, whole blood clearly appears to be a better product. But, you know, at essence, we're really scientists, aren't we? And we want to be sure that we're applying the best kind of clinical care to our patients. So is whole blood any good? Well, the evidence is certainly building. I'd recommend that you read this paper by Spinella out of the military literature. This was a comparison of patients who got warm, fresh whole blood, which is kind of the norm in the military environment, as compared to component therapy. And this group was actually showing that there was certainly a lower level of citrate that was administered to these patients, which can affect coagulopathy and things like hypocalcemia. But there was a significant survival advantage in the group here at 24 hours and at 30 days. And when you look at the Kaplan-Meier curve, there's a really interesting early separation that occurs in terms of the survival advantage. In whole blood, that's the dashed line at the top, and that kind of persists throughout the study period. This was a paper that came out in the civilian literature. It was really one of the only randomized controlled trials that we've had so far in the civilian literature out of Houston. It compared cold whole blood to component therapy. And just as an important aspect of this, at the time, the mechanisms to create that whole blood unit were such that they did affect platelet function to a degree. And so you have to take that into account in terms of the outcomes here. So although they showed a lower blood product requirement overall, they were not able to show a significant survival advantage. This is a paper that came out retrospectively out of our group as well as the group over in New Jersey. We looked at cold whole blood compared to component therapy, and certainly this showed that there was a survival advantage to getting people alive out of the trauma bay, but unfortunately no significant survival advantage towards the rest of their stay. And then more recently, this paper came out, which was a retrospective review of the National Trauma Database. They looked at patients who got whole blood as well as component therapy, which is a way a lot of centers are practicing in the civilian world, and compared that to component therapy alone. Again, there was here a significant survival advantage, however, at 24 hours, as well as during their hospital length of stay. So certainly the data is kind of evolving to show that there might be benefit, and we'll hopefully get more data as well from a joint kind of DoD study that several centers around the United States are doing with this LIGHT study group that will hopefully provide even more data. So what do we know right now? Whole blood seems to make physiologic sense. There seems to be a lower need for blood products overall in the group that get whole blood, and there may be a survival advantage. Certainly the more latest literature is pointing towards that. But the question is also what can go wrong. We always have to look at the downsides of any new therapy as well, right? So when you look at decades of kind of use, let's look back at World War II use. So several thousand units of whole blood were utilized, very few transfusion-related reactions or side effects, actually. And this was at the time because there was a significant knowledge about blood types and compatibility. But what was lacking early on was knowledge about antibody titers. So let's look at the physiology a little bit. So we know that there are 4 major blood groups. Each one expresses different antibodies on its surface to which antigens in the blood can react to it. And so the majority of patients will have either type A or type O blood. And so you want to immediately, in terms of when you're looking at donors, take out the other groups because they're not very frequent, plus there's a higher risk of antigen-antibody reactions. The group A also has a high risk of antigen-antibody reaction, so they get taken out as a potential source for whole blood. And so that really leaves us with type O whole blood, and that's what we've utilized really across the years for patients getting whole blood therapy. So we really want to look at preferably type O patients, and we want to look at their antibody titers, and we can measure that now. The blood bank can do that for you, and that should be less than 1 to 256. So when you look at the hundreds of thousands of units that have been used in the Korean War as well as the Vietnam War, very few transfusion-related reactions. And more recently, when you look at the more recent conflicts, this is data from Operation Enduring Freedom that had, again, several thousand units of whole blood utilized, very few, if any, notable reactions. So not only does this make physiologic sense, might need less blood product requirement overall, may have a survival advantage, but it appears to be pretty safe. And I think that's like a testament that we've now seen over decades and decades of use. So logistically, how do you bring this about? You know, in the military, we have the benefit of having the ability to create a walking blood bank. So the ease there is that we know who the donors are, we know what their blood types are, so should a mass casualty happen, people can line up very quickly with already kind of pre-tested blood that we know what their blood type is, so we know who can be the potential donors. Again, that can actually be brought into civilian practice as well, and this paper is interesting, came out of Scandinavia, that showed that they were able to actually utilize this in the civilian setting to be able to have a walking blood bank for fresh whole blood, and certainly in perhaps more rural communities or even in urban environments, this might be something to look into. Storage with the modern refrigerators is certainly useful to allow storage of products, and that can allow a donor drive to be done, and then you have a pool of blood available to you should an event happen where you need it. So the product that we're actually using is cold stored type O leukoreduced male donor low titer whole blood. And so we use type O as we saw the most common donor. Leukoreduction technique is really to minimize the response of in terms of inflammation when transfused to the recipient. And we use male donor preferentially because we've had data that shows that female donors tend to cause a higher risk of ARDS. So we prefer male donors here. The American Association of Blood Banking does allow a longer storage period of up to 35 days now, so it means that you can utilize your blood for longer. But it's important to understand that with our current methodology, the platelet function does diminish over time. And so just be aware about that the older blood units may have a lower platelet function, and that may affect outcomes. This is our algorithm at Penn. So we have, if you're an adult male or female outside of reproductive age, and really that's there just to minimize the risk of rhesus isoimmunization, although we're talking about removing that because certainly, if you die from hemorrhagic shock, there's no concern for isoimmunization later on. But nevertheless, if you're in those age groups and demographics and you come in with a severe injury and you're not dead, you don't have a severe TBI, and you score 2 or more on the ABC score, which you see in the corner there, then you're eligible to get up to 4 units of whole blood in the trauma bay, and that can go up with you to the operating room as well. And in our over 2.5 years of utilizing whole blood at our center, we really only had 2 major problems, and those were both transfusion-associated circulatory overload, probably due to pre-existing conditions. So it's great to have this whole blood with us here in the trauma center, but clearly we probably have more benefit of bringing this to scene, right? And there's already several agencies that are using component therapy in their vehicles, and certainly that could be of benefit to patients, really, because when you look at this data, and I really encourage you to read this paper that showed that the most significant potentially preventable death happens early on, well before 30 minutes in patients who have severe torso injuries. And when you factor in the average pre-hospital time, something needs to be done to prevent that death from hemorrhagic shock. The group out of Pittsburgh, PAMPER trial, really did a great job showing that, especially in patients with more prolonged transport times of 40 minutes or so, pre-hospital plasma did a much better job than, in terms of outcomes, as opposed to patients who got crystalloid instead. And actually, when they did a secondary analysis of the results, they found that the group that got both pre-hospital plasma and packed red cells did much better than the plasma alone group, and certainly much better than the crystalloid group as well. So why not just replace that with whole blood? And this was the thinking of several groups, including Thor and the Committee on Tactical Combat Casualty Care. And certainly when you look around the world and around the United States as well, there are several agencies now that are utilizing whole blood on their vehicle and have developed kind of systems to be able to deliver that appropriately and safely. And in fact, we've had a lot of precedent from this from the cruise ship industry. I'm not sure when the cruises will get back online, but certainly up until the pandemic, they were certainly utilizing this very regularly and very successfully, and have published a few case series on the utilization of that. So just in summary, again, remember, whole blood, is it better than the sum of its parts? I think so. It makes physiologic sense. There's a lower blood product requirement overall. That's what we're seeing from the studies. It's certainly over decades and decades of use in multiple wars and in civilian practice shown to be safe. It may well have a survival advantage as well, and it can be moved pre-hospital. So certainly consider that in your planning. If you're thinking about bringing blood into your vehicles where you haven't done so, or if you already carry packed red cells, think about moving to whole blood. It may well confer a significant survival benefit to your patients. So again, listen, thanks to Eric and everybody at the FAST Symposium Organizing Committee for the invitation to speak to you guys today. I really look forward to speaking to you guys in person in the near future. And I'm always open to answer any questions. Feel free to reach out to me at any point. Thanks so much.
Mikey V,
buddy,
how are you?
We're together.
That's not on a Zoom screen, is it?
I know. It is so weird, and we came a long way to do this.
A long way. Where are we right now?
So we are in Glens Falls, New York. Here, Dr. Jarvis is doing stuff for the initial assessment conference.
Stuff I am.
He just finished an all-day advanced airway course, all day. I've been sitting here with my wife setting up all this goodness.
Yep.
Which you're not seeing very much of right now.
But trust me on this, it is good.
It's good. And we're here at IAC 2021. Fire Dog Productions in the house, doing live streaming, podcasting. A lot of people in town doing some in-person teaching for the first time in a very
long time. Since for the 4 times.
Yeah.
The situation.
The before times, exactly.
Mikey, I got a question for you.
Lay it on me.
There you were, in the field.
I remember those days.
Cardiac arrest.
Yes.
You throw them in the back of the truck, get to the magic of the hospital.
Absolutely.
Or do you work them on scene?
Well, there were 2 times in my life, sort of old style medical directors, new style medical directors, and for the longest time we did. We got to get them to the hospital. And in fact, I prided myself on riding the rail, doing one-handed CPR. It made for an amazing photo.
It did, as long as you didn't hit anything. But that's a future paper.
Exactly. But they didn't. That was not good compressions. Now, fast forward, I can't tell you how long it's been since we transported cardiac arrest. We don't.
You know what would be nice is if we had a way, maybe through like a methodology of looking at outcomes and comparing outcomes between those people in cardiac arrest who had intra-transport resuscitation, in other words, load and go, versus those with on-scene resuscitation, stay and play.
I think that's good. And if I'm not mistaken, you're going to tell us about it right now.
I think we are. Let's go to it.
All right.
Guys, y'all may not know it, but I am a huge fan of The Clash. Being a child of the 80s, how could I not? Combat Rock was one of my favorite albums ever, and you may not know it, but there is a song on that album that is really important to resuscitation. Should we stay or should we go? Do we work our codes on scene? Do we stay and play? Or do we throw them in the back of the ambulance and drive really fast to the magic that is the hospital? What do we do? What is the best approach? Well, there was this study in JAMA that talked exactly about this question. So let's go through it. What were the methods in the PICO question? So this was a secondary analysis of the ROC epistry, great big cardiac arrest registry that was done for a couple of ROC trials. The time we were enrolling patients between 2011 and 2015, and the analysis they did, really fancy methods, but they basically tried to account for the effect of whether you resuscitated on scene and only transported after getting ROSC, or whether you went ahead and did intra-arrest transport. So they did this with what they call a time-dependent propensity-matched study. Now, I'm going to skip over those methods for the sake of time. Bottom line, I think these were probably about as good a methods as you can do without doing this as a randomized controlled trial. Who did they look at? We're talking about adult non-traumatic arrest, 10 North American ROC sites. So these were the sites we've come to know and love from all of the ROC trials. And they looked at outcome in terms of on-scene resuscitation, which means that you did not transport until you got ROSC, or intra-arrest transport, which means that your en-route time was before your ROSC time, or there may not have been ROSC. So, what is the impact intra-arrest transport versus on-scene stay and play on survival to discharge and neurologically intact survival? What did they find? Survival to hospital discharge almost twice as high, actually more than twice as high for resuscitations on scene. 8.5 times 4%. That is a difference of almost 5% difference, and that is statistically significant. If you calculate that as an odds ratio, you have a 50%, 52 as a matter of fact, percent decrease in the odds of survival to hospital discharge with intra-arrest resuscitation. How about neurologically intact survival? A very similar risk difference. Here you have a 40% reduction in the adjusted odds of survival with intra-arrest transport. So here, if you take a look, now this is an interesting thing. This just looks at all arrest by site. Remember, there were multiple sites, EMS systems in this trial. This just plots the save rate, if you will, the survival to hospital discharge rate for a system against the rate of intra-arrest transport for that system. So this is 10,000-foot broad view, no propensity matching, just what does it look like? And what you can see here, Site A, for example, they only had about 12, maybe 8 to 12-ish percent intra-arrest transport, load and go. And their overall survival to hospital discharge rate was around 18-19%. Now, if you're comparing this to your Utstein survival rate, stop it right there because we're talking all comers. You show up there in a systole, that's included in here. So 20% all comer adult non-traumatic survival, not too shabby. And what you notice is that that is the site that did not do a whole lot of load and go. On the other extreme, take a look over there at Site J. They had about 800 arrests. They had 60% intra-arrest transport. They loaded and went with everybody, and their overall survival rate, around 5%. So a 15% difference in overall survival rate, that is huge. Now, there absolutely can be some very critical differences between Site J and Site A. We don't know about this. Remember, 10,000-foot rule of thumb view. But you can easily plot a line through there, and as your percentage of intra-arrest transport increases, your survival decreases. What is the overall message from this study? Should we stay? Should we go? Well, if you value a 40% increase in the odds of neurologically intact survival, stay and play, work the resuscitation on scene.
All right, thanks for that, Dr. Jarvis. Weird because you were there, but now you're here again, but whatever.
It's confusing.
But up to 40% increased odds of a neurologically intact survival by staying on scene. Makes a lot of sense to me. I mean, again, we've been doing that for years. If you do that, put it in the chat. We want to know. We're monitoring the chat right now, so do you stay and play or do you load and go?
I also want to hear your comments about how The Clash is amazing. Just put that in there too.
I wouldn't put that, but that's just me.
Rock the Casbah, baby. Rock the Casbah.
Yeah, you're showing your age right now.
As though the lack of hair doesn't?
Well, whatever. So let me ask you this. We know we should go to a cardiac arrest call with red lights and sirens.
Probably a safe bet.
Right? I mean, that's one of those, that's the Super Bowl, right?
I think so.
That's what we're going to do. But what about other calls, right? Is the juice worth the squeeze, so to speak, on a lot of other emergencies, air quotes, that we go on.
Mikey, you have hit the nail on the head. That is exactly the question that is important. We know that red lights and sirens is dangerous. That's how EMTs and paramedics get killed and hurt. That is a great way to shorten a career. The question is that risk, the juice, worth the squeeze? What we need is a methodology to help us determine when we should use lights and sirens. In other words, what is the clinical yield of red lights and sirens?
Let's talk about it.
Let's do it.
All right.
Live back to Georgetown, Texas.
That's right. Let's go.
Now, since we've been talking about cardiac arrest and we talked about the importance of getting there rapidly, it's a useful extrapolation to say how important is getting to any scene rapidly. If we want to get to a scene rapidly, we have to use red lights and sirens, right? Well, there's been a fair amount of research done on this, and we can see that red lights and sirens does, on average, get us there quicker, about 2 to 4 minutes, depending on the environment and the study. That's about how much time red lights and sirens saves us. Now, we also know that the use of red lights and sirens increases the risk of collision. It increases the risk of injury. This is how EMTs and paramedics are hurt, is by trying to do CPR in the back of an ambulance unrestrained with lights and sirens, which increases the likelihood of harm. So the question is, if this intervention has some potential for benefit, but also has the potential for harm, how do we weigh those risks and benefits? Well, we need to know which calls, which times are those red lights and sirens useful? In other words, when will they have the highest yield? Well, in order to find that out, we need to figure out what the yield of red lights and sirens is. And it turns out that this was exactly the question that we looked at with an ESO study. So me and Mike Tagman and Vaughn Hamilton and Lawrence Brown published this paper in PEC. What did we do? We took the ESO data set, massive data set, over 7.5 million 911 calls. What did we find? We wanted to know how often, when we use lights and sirens to a call, do we actually do something important? Well, the first thing we found out is we go lights and sirens to everything. 86% of all responses were within lights and sirens. Now, the good news is that we respond much less often to the hospital from the scene with lights and sirens. So we get there, we determine that, you know what, it turns out not that big a deal. We don't need to go lights and sirens to the hospital. We did that only 13% of the time. Now, we calculated the rate of potentially life-saving interventions, and overall, EMS did a potentially life-saving intervention only 7% of the time we used lights and sirens to the hospital, to the scene. That is not a very good rate. So 93% of the time we are using lights and sirens to the scene, we don't do anything that could vaguely be considered life-saving or time-sensitive. Now, you may say, well, it depends on what you call a life-saving intervention, and that is absolutely true. But we did include in there things like early STEMI recognition, early stroke recognition, STEMI alerts, trauma alerts, stroke alerts. Those were considered potentially life-saving interventions, still only 7% of the time. So what do we figure out about this? Now, in the paper, we actually broke this down and calculated the rate of the clinical yield for different call determinants using EMD. But ultimately, what we determined from this paper is that we use lights and sirens a lot, 86% of the time, and we can safely decrease the times we use lights and sirens, and we can do it in a methodologically sound way. So let's just say that we want a 5% threshold for any given call determinant. If we're going to respond lights and sirens to this call determinant, we want to be doing something life-saving, something time-sensitive at least 5% of the time. If we use that as a threshold, we will see a 47% reduction in the use of lights and sirens. If you set that threshold at 10%, well, we only want to go lights and sirens if we're going to do something life-saving 10%, that would be a 62% reduction in the use of red lights and sirens.
All right, so let me get this straight. So 86% of the time, we're going code 3, lights and sirens.
All the things.
And there's not much, let's go back to my fruit analogy, not much juice for the squeeze on that.
Not much. A lot of pulp, no juice.
Okay, all right. Well, if we're only doing a potentially life-saving intervention about 7% of the time, yeah, that math doesn't work for me. So
Not so much.
Yeah, so it makes me think about another thing we do.
What's that?
Well, let me just tell you. There are certain people out there that believe that things like video laryngoscopy, you only use that if you can't do it the way you were trained to do it. So I'm wondering, has there been anything that looks at potentially VL versus DL, or even augmented DL for that matter? And is that something that has any interest to you at all?
Well, Ginger has called me the airway evangelist, primarily because I am passionate about airway management. And you probably know I really like me some hyperacute angled video laryngoscopy.
This guy does.
So I hear constantly that the reason video performs better than DL is we're not doing DL right. We need to use us some bougie. We need a little external manipulation.
Right.
We need a little head elevation. We need a little ramped position.
Yep.
So I think a great question is, does run-of-the-mill VL, how does it compare in first pass success to DL with the stuff, the game,
all the other stuff,
whole package?
Yeah. Well, I don't know, but I have a feeling we're going back to Georgetown right now.
Georgetown. Come on, Texas. What we got? I'll tell you what we got. Right now, we got the Astros putting a whooping on the Yankees is what we got. Now, by now, we're probably losing.
Right, yeah.
All right, guys, I don't think there is any doubt that I am a fan of video laryngoscopy. Huge fan of video laryngoscopy. The big question is, do we see higher first pass success rates with video versus direct? Well, a big question here is, well, DL is about how you use it. It's in the way that you use it. So this was a study that looked at a bunch of different types of augmented direct laryngoscopy. By augmented, they mean the use of bougie or head elevation or external laryngeal manipulation or some combination of that. And what they wanted to find out is, what is the impact on first pass success of using unaided, plain, boring, nothing fancy video laryngoscopy compared to DL done right. What did we find? So this was a secondary analysis of the NEAR registry. NEAR is the National Emergency Airway Registry. Beautiful thing, something we need desperately for EMS. It is a survey of 25 academic emergency departments where they log all of their intubations, and then they fill out a data form to get us extra information. This was looking at intubations done between 2016 and 2017. And again, we talked about what they're combining, what they're comparing, I should say, unaided VL versus aided direct laryngoscopy. And they're looking at the impact on first pass success. All right, bottom line, what did they find? First pass success with unaided, plain, boring VL. VL of any type, essentially 91%. Augmented DL, DL with all the extras, all the things, 81%. Now, you can look at adjusted odds ratios because you might say, if you were thinking about this, and this would be a good thing to think about, well, VL is better for harder cases. Therefore, if we predict, based on things like the Heaven criteria, that this patient is going to be a difficult intubation, maybe we should use VL because it gives us a higher first pass success rate. Now that does, to me anyway, raise the question of, well, why don't you just use the best thing for everybody? But that's a topic for a different rant. That, you can think that, well, maybe we're only using VL in this registry for the harder intubations, so they did a model to come up with an adjusted odds ratio for first pass success, and they included things like age, indication, was this trauma, was this cardiac arrest, body habitus, Cormack-Lehan grade view, was this a difficult intubation? They looked at all those, threw them into the mix, and what did they find? Again, overall odds ratio, first pass success, including those risk factors, 2.8. That's 180% improved odds of first pass success with plain boring VL versus DL with all the things. Now, they also, you probably know I'm a big fan of the hyperacute angled. Well, they looked at just those compared to DL with all the things. Odds ratio 3.2. That's 220% improved odds of first pass success. Well, what about standard geometry VL? In other words, the MAC. What did they find? 2.4 adjusted odds of increased survival. Now, you can't really look and say 3.2 with hyperacute is better than 2.4 with standard as much as I would like to, because that's not what it was set up to do. So bottom line is, with all the things, all the bells, all the whistles, all the bougies, all the elevation, all the external laryngeal manipulation, DL was still about 10% lower absolute difference in first pass success. I think this paper, it's not a randomized controlled trial, which would be challenging. I'm trying to figure out how to do that. But I think this is good evidence that in a general population, at least in the emergency department, VL wins. And I think the impact we would see in the field, where in general, rule of thumb, on average, ER doctors get more experience with intubation, more times at bat than paramedics do. So I think the impact would be even better.
Okay, so 90 first pass success, 81, 82% first pass success. Really, at the end of the day, does it matter? What's the difference in reality?
Well, it's about, 10%. So
right, but is that statistically significant, or is that clinically, and does it make a difference to me on the street?
So great question. Dr. Crow would be very pleased with this. It is definitely statistically significant, no doubt about it. Your question, though, is, what does it matter to me and to my patient?
Yeah.
So statistics can't answer that. Is this statistically significant difference clinically relevant? Well, one of the things that we know is that first pass success is important. And the reason it's important is when you miss, the more attempts that you make, the more adverse events that you get. The biggest of those is hypoxia. Hypoxia is associated with peri-intubation cardiac arrest. That's bad. We don't like killing our patients when we're trying to help them. A 10% improved first pass success, I think, is clinically relevant.
All right, well, for those of you that out there in charge of your budgets and don't have VL, now you've got a little ammunition to go and take to your leaders, your clinical leaders out there.
Pay up, baby.
That's right. All right, so let us get out of here. So on behalf of Dr. Jeff Jarvis, Mike Verkest, you've been listening to and watching the Best of the EMS Lighthouse Project podcast at Fast 21. Jeff, great to see you.
Good to see you, Mike.
All you guys out there, we hope you got some interesting comments put in the chat. We can't wait to see that. And other than that,
I do have one last thing to say.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
This is a Fire Dog production.
All right, we will see you guys later.